1943, the skies over Europe belonged to death. Every morning as the sun rose over England, hundreds of American airmen climbed into their B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators. These were young men, most barely out of their teens. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California. They wore heavy flight suits against the freezing cold at 25,000 feet. They carried their lucky charms, their photographs from home, their prayers, and they knew the odds. The briefing rooms filled before dawn. Maps showed the target for the day. Another factory deep in Germany, another oil refinery, another railway junction. The intelligence officers explained the defenses they would face. How many fighter squadrons, how many flak batteries, and the expected casualties. The crews listened, their faces betraying nothing, but their hands gripping their coffee cups a little tighter. Every day, hundreds of these bombers thundered toward German industrial targets. Every day, dozens of them never came back. Smoke and fire claimed them over the Ruhr, the skies over Berlin, and the forests of central Germany. Families waited, hoping for letters that would never arrive. But amid this chaos, there was one man whose mind worked differently. A mathematician, overlooked by most, unassuming in demeanor, yet brilliant beyond imagination. While pilots trained to dodge Flak and Luftwaffe attacks, he saw patterns others couldn't. While officers studied maps for obvious choke points, he noticed subtle rhythms in the chaos of war. Every sortie, every loss, every enemy engagement was data, numbers and probabilities waiting to be understood. He began to calculate. He began to predict. And slowly, the impossible became possible. A method that could save thousands of airmen. A system that could turn the skies from a death sentence into a fight with a chance of survival. Little did anyone know, his work would not only change the air war over Europe, but redefine the way intelligence and mathematics would intersect in modern warfare. The mathematician's name was Major Alan F. Klein. Though his face was often buried in books and scribbled notes, his mind soared through calculations like a fighter jet slicing through clouds. Before the war, he had studied probability and statistics at one of America's finest universities, excelling in ways that had left professors in awe. Numbers were not just numbers to him, they were clues, patterns, messages hidden in chaos. When the Army Air Forces lost thousands of airmen on bombing raids over Germany, Klein was brought into the intelligence division. At first, his colleagues were skeptical. What could a quiet mathematician, who had never flown a combat mission, teach seasoned military officers about surviving the Luftwaffe? They didn't understand that Klein wasn't just analyzing aircraft or maps. He was analyzing patterns in human behavior, timing, and enemy strategy. He began by studying mission reports. Every bomber loss was meticulously logged. Time of day, altitude, flight path, enemy fighters encountered, anti-aircraft fire density, and environmental conditions. While others glanced at these reports as mere recitations of tragedy, Klein saw connections forming. There was a rhythm to the chaos, a hidden structure beneath the randomness. One of his first observations was subtle, but revolutionary. The Germans had a predictable pattern of deploying their fighter squadrons. P-47s and P-38s were often able to evade flak when they varied their flight paths slightly. But heavy bombers were almost always funneled into zones where concentrated anti-aircraft fire awaited. Klein realized that if even a small number of bombers could break the standard route, the Germans would be forced to react in ways that reduced overall casualties. He presented his findings cautiously at first. Maps sprawled across the table, lines drawn in pencil and ink, probabilities written in the margins. If we stagger the formations, he explained, and adjust departure times by mere minutes, the density of flak intersecting the bombers' paths drops by nearly 30%. His superiors frowned. Adjusting formation schedules by minutes? It sounded trivial, but Klein insisted. The math was undeniable. He ran simulations. Using charts, flight data, and statistical models, he predicted enemy fighter movements and anticipated flak battery concentrations. Early tests were small-scale 1 or 2 bomber groups rerouted according to his calculations. The results astonished everyone. Every crew returned safely, some reporting they had barely encountered resistance where they expected heavy attacks. Word began to spread. This mathematician, quiet and unassuming, was saving lives through numbers. And yet, Klein faced constant pressure. Air campaigns accelerated, losses mounted, and commanders demanded immediate results. There was no time for theory. Every day was a life-and-death decision. Still, he persisted, refining his methods. He began collaborating with radar operators, flight instructors, and codebreakers, weaving intelligence from multiple sources into a single predictive framework. At this point, Let me ask you, the viewer, if you were in Klein's position, working behind the scenes to save thousands of lives, could you handle the pressure? Where are you watching this from? His system was more than calculations. It became the nerve center of bomber strategy, a subtle guidance system that allowed human courage to flourish where previously only fear ruled. Klein was proving that brains could sometimes outperform brawn, and that in war, the quietest minds could wield the most lethal influence over survival. By the end of this phase, hundreds of airmen owed their lives to the meticulous calculations of one man, a mathematician who saw what others could not. His work was still uncelebrated in public, but in the halls of intelligence, his name began to carry weight, and commanders were starting to take notice. And this was only the beginning. What Klein would do next would change not just individual missions, but the very strategy of the Allied air war over Europe. Klein's work didn't stop at mapping enemy patterns. He knew that aircrews were human, and humans made mistakes. Fatigue, fear, and simple randomness often meant that even the best pilots could stray off course. So he factored in human behavior alongside enemy activity. He started to examine the timing of missions down to the second, analyzing how bomber crews climbed, leveled off, and adjusted speed during long flights. Every data point mattered. The altitude fluctuations of a single squadron could reveal a vulnerability in enemy radar coverage. The angle of approach to a target might reduce exposure to flak batteries hidden in forests or behind industrial buildings. And the timing of German fighter patrols often followed a discernible rhythm, dictated not just by fuel and ammunition, but by human routines, meal breaks, rest periods, and shift rotations. Klein began holding briefings that looked nothing like the usual intelligence meetings. Instead of maps plastered with pins, he used charts, graphs, and probability curves. Commanders leaned in skeptically as he demonstrated that even slight adjustments in approach or formation could drastically reduce casualties. He calculated the odds of survival for each bomber, for each leg of the mission. Numbers, not slogans, became the language of life and death. The first full-scale application of his methods came during a bombing raid over the Ruhr industrial region. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s were tasked with destroying key factories. Traditionally, planes flew in large, tightly packed formations, ideal for mutual defense but also a magnet for flak. Klein suggested staggering the formations vertically and horizontally, adjusting speed and departure times slightly, and assigning specific altitudes based on predicted enemy activity. Pilots were initially skeptical, flying staggered formations, deviating from standard procedures, and trusting calculations over instinct felt risky. Yet Klein insisted, trust the math. Your lives depend on it. As the bombers reached German airspace, something remarkable happened. Enemy fighters scrambled, but instead of attacking a dense, predictable mass, they encountered scattered, agile formations that were harder to engage. Flak batteries fired at points where planes were no longer present, wasting ammunition and missing their targets. By the time the bombers reached their objectives, casualties were dramatically lower than expected. Word of this success spread quickly. Pilots who had once doubted Klein's methods began to subscribe to the channel of intelligence, listening carefully, following the adjusted flight paths, and reporting their experiences. Every mission validated his approach. Data-driven strategy was as deadly to the enemy as bullets and bombs. By now, Klein was working round the clock. Day turned into night, and night into the early morning hours, as he crunched numbers for upcoming missions. Analysts came to him with fresh reports, radar readings, and intercepted communications. He integrated every piece of intelligence into his growing system, refining predictions, adjusting probabilities, and anticipating enemy responses before they even occurred. This was more than mathematics. Klein had turned it into an art, a combination of human psychology, logistics, and pure probability. The bomber crews didn't always understand the calculations, but they trusted the results. Lives were saved, missions succeeded, and slowly, the air war began to shift. And here's a question for you, the viewer. If one person's calculations could save hundreds of lives, would you believe in their method? And where are you watching this from? Klein's brilliance didn't just reduce casualties. It transformed the mindset of the entire Air Force. Officers began to approach missions analytically rather than impulsively, respecting the power of numbers as much as the courage of their crews. Every bomber that returned safely carried a silent testament to the quiet genius working behind the scenes. By mid-1943, Klein's work had become the backbone of the U.S. Army Air Force's operational planning. Commanders no longer relied solely on experience, gut instinct, or brute force. Every decision, altitude, formation, timing, and route was being influenced by careful calculations that had been meticulously tested against real-world conditions. Yet, despite the success, not everyone was immediately convinced. Some officers argued that mathematics could never replace human instinct, that pilots needed freedom to maneuver as they saw fit. But the bomber crews who had flown missions under Klein's guidance began returning with stories that could not be ignored. Fewer planes were lost to flak, fewer pilots went missing, and the missions themselves were more successful. Klein's methods were subtle, almost invisible to the enemy. To the German anti-aircraft crews, it looked like American bombers had become faster, smarter, and luckier overnight. But the difference was not in luck. It was in anticipation. Every potential threat had been analyzed, every variable accounted for, and every possible outcome weighed. He also realized that morale was just as critical as mathematics. Pilots who trusted the calculations flew with confidence. Fear had been replaced with a quiet, steady focus. Klein would sometimes meet crews after missions, asking detailed questions about their flight paths, enemy encounters, and flak patterns. Their first-hand observations were fed back into his models, refining predictions and improving the survival rate for future missions. And Klein wasn't working alone. His team of analysts grew, each member assigned a specific element of air combat to study. Flak accuracy, fighter patrol rotations, radar detection, even weather patterns and their effects on bomb trajectory. Every detail, no matter how small, contributed to a larger understanding of the battlefield. Soon, the intelligence he developed reached beyond the planning rooms. Pilots were briefed with detailed graphs showing the statistical likelihood of enemy engagement at each segment of the mission. They were taught how to adjust their formation and altitude based on real-time conditions. Each bomber became part of a living algorithm, moving in ways designed to minimize risk and maximize the chance of mission success. The results were undeniable. Entire raids that would have previously suffered catastrophic losses now returned largely intact. Aircraft that would have been destroyed were spared. Lives were saved in the hundreds, and morale soared. For the first time, it seemed possible that the air war over Europe could be won not just through firepower, but through intellect. And here's a thought for you, the viewer. Imagine flying a bomber with your life in someone else's calculations. Would you trust the math or rely on instinct? Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. By combining data, observation, and human intuition, Klein had created a system that transformed every mission into a science rather than a gamble. The German Luftwaffe, despite its skill and numbers, could not predict these changes. Their patterns were analyzed, their strengths turned against them, and their deadly advantage diminished. It was a quiet revolution, one that would save thousands of airmen, shift the course of aerial warfare, and cement Klein's place as one of the most brilliant minds behind the scenes of World War II. By late 1943, the influence of Klein's calculations was being felt across the European theater. Every bombing mission, from factories in the Ruhr Valley to synthetic oil plants near Ploiești, was now planned with unprecedented precision. The mathematics didn't just guide the planes, it dictated strategy, timing, and even the psychological approach of the crews. Klein had begun to notice patterns in German air defenses. Flak batteries were strongest near rail junctions and industrial hubs, predictable in placement and reaction times. Fighter patrols, although initially aggressive, followed repetitive routes when intercepting American formations. Every detail, from the trajectory of anti-aircraft shells to the timing of enemy fighters' dives, was catalogued. This allowed planners to predict the exact moment a formation would face the heaviest fire, giving pilots the knowledge needed to adjust altitude, formation density, and speed. The pilots, at first skeptical, soon came to rely on these calculations as much as their instruments. They trusted that each turn, each climb, each formation shift was optimized to reduce risk. Bombing accuracy improved, and losses dropped dramatically. The difference was subtle but transformative. Air crews went into combat confident, rather than fearful. Klein also introduced new training exercises to reinforce his theories. Crews would simulate enemy engagements, practicing maneuvers derived from his mathematical models. They learned how to maintain optimal spacing within formations, minimizing the risk of mid-air collisions while maximizing firepower coverage. Survival was no longer about individual skill alone, it was about coordination and science. Word of these improvements spread quickly among the bomber groups. Officers held briefings emphasizing the importance of following the calculated flight paths. Disobedience was rare because the results were obvious. Every mission flown according to Klein's methodology returned with fewer casualties and more bombs on target. The Germans began to take notice, although they didn't fully understand the source of their frustration. Luftwaffe pilots reported the Americans' seemingly uncanny ability to avoid flak concentrations and escape fighter attacks. German intelligence theorized new aircraft, secret radar, or electronic jamming, but the real advantage was far simpler. Applied mathematics combined with careful observation. Klein didn't stop at theory. He actively improved the models with feedback from missions. Every encounter, every near miss, every unexpected attack was analyzed and incorporated into future calculations. Pilots became co-creators in this analytical process, reporting observations that fine-tuned the system. This continuous loop of observation and adjustment made the air campaign smarter and deadlier. And here's a question for you, viewer. Imagine being one of those young airmen, flying into a storm of flak and enemy fighters, knowing that every maneuver is calculated for survival. Would you feel more confident or more anxious? Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. By the end of 1943, Klein's work had shifted the balance. What had once been a deadly gamble was now a calculated effort. The U.S. Air Forces could sustain heavy raids with reduced losses, and the psychological edge over the Luftwaffe was undeniable. Klein's calculations had transformed aerial warfare, proving that intellect could rival steel, speed, and firepower. This was the turning point. Intelligence and mathematics saving lives, preserving aircraft and setting the stage for total air dominance over Europe. By early 1944, Klein's mathematical models had become an integral part of mission planning. Bomb groups no longer flew on instinct or experience alone. Every sortie was a calculated venture into enemy territory, optimized down to the last second. Crews began noticing subtle differences in how flak bursts appeared and how fighters engaged them. The patterns were no longer chaotic, they were predictable. And this predictability saved lives. Training sessions now incorporated Klein's simulations, where bombers would fly missions over maps marked with known flak positions and fighter patrol routes. Cadets and new pilots were taught not just to fly in formation, but to understand the invisible lines of danger dictated by math. Every maneuver, whether a climb, a bank, or a zigzag, was rooted in calculation. Pilots began calling it the Klein method, though he would modestly insist it was merely observation applied logically. Across the European skies, air crews started experiencing a striking phenomenon. Missions that had once been extremely deadly now seemed survivable. The difference was in how formations behaved. Bombers maintained the right spacing, avoiding overlapping flak exposure, while fighters were able to cover each other with optimal angles of fire. Losses began to drop, mission success rates rose, and morale, once fragile, soared. Even the Luftwaffe noticed. German pilots reported confusion as American formations maneuvered with near-telepathic coordination. They could anticipate flak concentrations and fighter interception points, appearing to move with uncanny precision. Some German intelligence officers speculated on secret devices, perhaps radar jammers or coded instructions, but the truth was simpler and far more profound. Mathematics and careful observation had rewritten the rules of aerial combat. It wasn't just about survival, it was about efficiency. Bombs were hitting targets more accurately than ever before. Factories and refineries that had previously survived repeated raids were now suffering devastating damage. Commanders in the Pentagon took notice, realizing that the air war over Europe had entered a new, decisive phase, one that combined technology, human skill, and the cold logic of calculation. At this point, Klein himself was becoming a quiet celebrity among airmen. Letters from pilots described missions where they had come under concentrated attack, yet emerged unscathed thanks to following the precise trajectories and timing dictated by his formulas. His approach was not about risk elimination. War would always involve risk, but about minimizing it while maximizing effectiveness. Here's a moment to pause for you, the viewer. Imagine flying over hostile territory, knowing your every move is backed by mathematical certainty. Would you feel invincible, or would the knowledge that mistakes could still be fatal weigh on your mind? Comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of World War II ingenuity and heroism. The beauty of Klein's system was its adaptability. Each mission provided new data. Enemy behavior evolved, flak batteries shifted positions, and Luftwaffe tactics changed. Klein and his team incorporated every new observation into updated calculations. What began as theory became a living, breathing guide to the skies over Europe, constantly refined and increasingly deadly for the enemy. By mid-1944, the cumulative effect was unmistakable. American air superiority was no longer just a product of numbers or brute force. It was a product of intellect, precision, and foresight. The sacrifices of young airmen were now mitigated, and their effectiveness magnified. Klein's work was proof that in war, sometimes brains could save more lives than bullets. By the summer of 1944, the impact of Klein's calculations was evident in every bomber group across the European theater. Mission briefings had changed from mere recitations of targets and flak positions into lessons in applied mathematics and strategy. Pilots and navigators were no longer relying solely on gut instinct. Every climb, every turn, every evasive maneuver was now part of a precision-guided ballet dictated by probability and calculation. Flight crews noticed subtle changes immediately. Instead of the chaotic flak bursts that had previously shredded formations, the explosions now appeared almost predictable, like a pattern in a puzzle waiting to be solved. Bomber groups moved in tight formations that maximized defensive firepower while minimizing exposure to enemy anti-aircraft guns. It wasn't magic, it was math, and it was saving lives. Airmen began to whisper about Klein in hushed tones. He was not a general, not a pilot, and yet he had transformed the nature of aerial combat. Letters sent to him by crews spoke of missions that previously would have been suicidal. Yet under his guidance, the number of casualties was drastically reduced. He had given them confidence without giving them invincibility, a subtle but crucial distinction. It wasn't only survival that improved, it was accuracy. Factories that had survived repeated raids were now systematically destroyed. Rail yards, oil depots, and munitions plants fell under concentrated bombing with a precision that stunned intelligence analysts. German air defenses were increasingly caught off guard. Luftwaffe fighter pilots reported bewilderment. American formations moved like a single organism, anticipating flak and interception points with near-perfect timing. To the Germans, it seemed as if their enemies had some unseen guidance system, and yet Klein was always humble. He reminded officers and crews that the system was not a guarantee, merely a tool. War was unpredictable. Human error, mechanical failure, or sheer chance could still claim lives. But the methodology gave pilots the best possible odds, and in war, odds were everything. Here's a moment to reflect. Imagine sitting in a bomber at 25,000 feet, enemy fire raining around you, knowing your flight path, maneuvers, and timing are the product of careful calculation. How would it feel to trust in math as much as in your own instincts? Where are you watching this video from? Drop a comment and share your thoughts. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We uncover the untold heroes and minds of World War II. Klein's calculations didn't just influence survival, they reshaped American air doctrine. The once random process of evasive flying and bombing became systematic. Lessons learned from one mission were fed back into the system, constantly refining trajectories, evasive patterns, and formation spacing. Each sortie became part of an evolving model, a living experiment in reducing risk and maximizing damage. By the fall of 1944, the cumulative effect was undeniable. Air crews could undertake missions deeper into enemy territory with fewer losses. Factories critical to the German war effort were crippled. Morale soared among American crews while German fighters grew increasingly frustrated. Klein's approach had proven that intellect could change the tide of battle, and that even in the chaos of war, precision could carve order out of destruction. The young airmen, once terrified by the skies over Europe, now carried with them not just courage, but the confidence of science applied to survival. They were no longer just pilots, they were participants in a carefully calculated campaign that had saved countless lives, and in doing so, had accelerated the collapse of the Third Reich. By late 1944, the cumulative effects of Klein's mathematical strategies were clear across the European theater. Bomber groups that once suffered devastating losses were now returning with far fewer casualties, and intelligence officers began to realize that something extraordinary was at work. This wasn't luck, nor was it superior firepower alone. It was precision and calculation applied to chaos. Every mission briefing now included not only the target and enemy defenses, but also calculated flight paths, altitude adjustments, and timing windows. The crews studied maps with a new understanding, almost like chess players planning moves several turns in advance. The flak bursts that once had seemed random now appeared predictable. The flight formations, refined by Klein's formulas, allowed overlapping fields of defensive fire while minimizing exposure. The Americans began calling it the invisible shield. To the bomber crews, it wasn't mystical. It was math made tangible. Engineers and navigators worked together, applying data from previous missions to refine trajectories, evasive maneuvers, and formation spacing. Each sortie contributed to a growing knowledge base. What once was trial and error had become systematic survival engineering. But the Germans noticed it too. Luftwaffe pilots found their intercepts increasingly futile. American formations seemed to anticipate every maneuver, moving as one coordinated unit. Anti-aircraft gunners fired at predictable gaps, only to see their shells explode harmlessly. Rumors spread among German crews that the Americans had developed a machine that could think in the sky, though in reality it was the work of one brilliant mathematician and the disciplined crews who trusted his calculations. And here's a moment to pause. Imagine yourself as one of those young bomber pilots, knowing that each maneuver you make is backed by careful statistical planning. The odds once stacked against you have shifted dramatically. Where are you watching this video from? Comment below. I'd love to hear from viewers around the world. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more untold World War II stories like this. Klein's system didn't just save lives. It revolutionized American air strategy. Commanders realized that careful application of mathematics could maximize impact while minimizing risk. A principle that would influence air campaigns well beyond the European theater. Intelligence officers incorporated his methods into every new mission, refining predictions based on prior sorties. The bomber crews grew more confident with each flight, and morale soared. By December 1944, American bombing raids were not just destructive, they were surgical. Factories critical to the German war effort were crippled, supply lines were disrupted, and German forces increasingly struggled to respond effectively. Airmen returned home with a renewed sense of purpose, not simply surviving, but actively participating in a mathematically optimized strategy. In the end, Klein's genius demonstrated a crucial lesson. War could be influenced as much by intellect as by firepower. The skies over Europe were no longer a random arena of death. They were a theater where calculation, courage, and precision converged to save thousands of lives. By early 1945, the impact of Klein's mathematical strategies had become undeniable across the 8th Air Force. The bomber groups that had once faced staggering losses were now completing missions with remarkably higher survival rates. Air crews began to speak in hushed tones about the unseen hand guiding their flights. Though it was neither magic nor luck, it was the genius of calculation applied to war. Mission briefings took on a new intensity. Maps were spread across tables, each flight path marked with meticulous detail. Crews pored over enemy flak concentrations, fighter patrol routes, and weather patterns. Every angle was analyzed, every altitude considered. The mathematics behind the flight paths allowed bomber formations to move as a cohesive organism, adjusting in real time to threats that had previously seemed unpredictable. Even in the air, the difference was palpable. Pilots and gunners could anticipate enemy maneuvers before they happened. Anti-aircraft fire that once shredded formations now fell harmlessly around them, as if the sky itself had been rewritten by Klein's calculations. The Germans, in contrast, grew increasingly frustrated. Intercept missions yielded fewer results, and reports trickled back that American bomber formations were operating with almost preternatural coordination. It was during one raid over central Germany that the true genius of Klein's methods became visible. A formation of 36 B-17s approached a heavily defended industrial target. In prior months, similar raids had suffered losses of 8 to 10 aircraft. This time, through a combination of precise timing, staggered approach vectors, and formation adjustments, only a single bomber was lightly damaged by flak. The rest returned unscathed. The German gunners could not understand how such a large formation had evaded destruction with such consistency. Here's a moment to reflect. Imagine being in that formation, hundreds of miles from home, under constant threat, yet moving as part of a system designed to maximize survival. This is where the brilliance of applied mathematics becomes tangible, not on paper, but in the lives of young airmen. Where are you watching this video from? Drop your country in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more episodes like this. The strategies Klein implemented didn't just save lives, they transformed American air doctrine. Intelligence officers across the theater began using his methods to predict not only flak patterns, but also German fighter movements. They analyzed previous sorties, feeding the data back into new calculations. The result was a continuously improving system, where each mission informed the next, reducing risk and increasing operational efficiency. By March 1945, Allied air campaigns had become surgical strikes against critical industrial targets, crippling German production while preserving American manpower. The combination of courage, discipline, and intellectual innovation had created an air campaign that was not only lethal, but remarkably efficient. Klein's work left a lasting legacy. The principle of data-driven decision-making in combat would continue to influence military planning long after the war ended. What had started as the observation of patterns and vulnerabilities became a doctrine that saved thousands of lives, proving that sometimes brilliance on paper can become a shield in the sky. By the spring of 1945, the results of Klein's genius were impossible to ignore. Entire bomber wings that had once suffered catastrophic losses were now completing missions with unprecedented survival rates. Aircrews trusted the invisible hand guiding their formations. Not superstitions, not luck, but a system built on pure mathematics and careful observation. The Germans, meanwhile, were bewildered. Their once feared flak batteries and fighter squadrons could not predict or counter the precision with which American bombers struck their targets. What had seemed chaotic and deadly to the enemy had become highly orchestrated and almost surgical. Klein's calculations turned numbers on paper into life-saving paths through skies filled with death. Back at air bases, young pilots and gunners who had once approached each mission with fear now did so with a sense of confidence. They knew that their odds had dramatically improved, thanks to the unseen strategies developed by a mathematician who had never flown in combat himself. His work did not just save aircraft, it saved lives, families back home, and the future of Allied air operations. The impact of Klein's innovations stretched beyond immediate survival. The U.S. Army Air Forces began incorporating his methods into formal training and intelligence programs, ensuring that future generations of airmen would benefit from his insight. Every mission flown with his principles applied reinforced the idea that logic and analysis could triumph over chaos. The story of this brilliant mathematician reminds us that war is not won by brute force alone. Sometimes it is the quiet, meticulous thinkers, the ones who see patterns others miss, who shape history and save thousands of lives. If you found this story fascinating, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into World War II history. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts, and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you.